To best explain and quantitatively compare institutions of slavery in the past with the modern institution of slavery, um, I found it best to draw a comparison to one of the most visible and ancient forms of slavery that ever was, which is the construction of the Great Pyramids. So, ancient Egypt is the archetypal tyranny, especially in the Bible. It's renowned for its Great Pyramids, which of course were constructed on the backs of slave labor. There's a data point in the book Heroes of History by Will Durant, and it was written by Herodotus, who said that an individual Great Pyramid took 100,000 men laboring for 20 years straight to construct. And there were about 80, I think there's about 87 Great Pyramids in ancient Egypt. So if you run the numbers on that, and again, assuming that each slave labors for about 5,000 hours each year, that would come out to a total working time of 10 billion hours per Great Pyramid. So the ancient pharaohs, or the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, rather, who were the masters of that domain, actually had to employ 10 billion hours of labor to build a pyramid. And there's a bit of historic argument about whether it was exclusively slave labor or partially paid labor. But I think most historians agree that sovereignty was not evenly distributed in ancient Egypt. So the pharaohs had a lot of the power, the workers had very little. So it's very likely they were working largely against their will or in conditions that they did not find favorable. So for purposes of this piece, we're going to make the argument that an individual Great Pyramid required 10 billion hours of human time stolen via slave labor to construct. And then we'll use that to compare it to other forms of slavery. So the bridge I make here is that, so you have the ancient Great Pyramid that took 10 billion human hours to construct, and this is not the greatest pyramid scheme, if you will, in human history. And my argument here is that fiat currency itself is a pyramid scheme. And we need to first understand what this is. Many of you have probably heard of Ponzi schemes, multi-level marketing, and pyramid schemes, which largely mean the same thing. And what it is there's a hierarchical setup of network marketing. So it's users at a higher level selling to those lower down that then extract a rent or a profit from each successive layer of network that they're able to construct below themselves. This is how many multi-level marketing businesses work, but if they're selling a legitimate product, and clearly that's legitimate, a pyramid scheme would be something that is typically represented to have unrealistic or consistent returns, right? So like something in the crypto space was the BitConnect, right? That was guaranteeing a fixed return on crypto asset deposits over a given period of time, when in fact it was just a pyramid scheme. So it was using this multi-layered marketing technique to basically build this fictitious financial infrastructure. So for fiat currencies, what this looks like is a pyramid erected by central banks in collusion with the governments, with gold at the pinnacle, and the tiers below them can be thought of as the first layer would be the first recipients of new money, second layer would be the second recipients, so on and so forth, such that the lowest layer in the pyramid are those that receive the money last, the newly printed money last. And so if you can think about this pyramid actually constructing itself from the top down, right? You have gold at the pinnacle, this dark layer, and this is consistent with the depictions I use in the piece, is representative of the central bank, and then you have these dark gray layers below that it's constantly pumping out more of. That represents the newest recipients of fiat currency as the central bank prints more money, which again originally was intended to be a representation for gold, but following 1971, that redeemability was revoked. So now all of these paper promises are essentially irredeemable debt certificates, right? Backed by nothing more than belief in the taxing authority and future cash flows from taxpayers. So it's really, really kind of an insidious construction in that respect. So, it's kind of hard to believe maybe that even the world's most popular currency, the US dollar, is a pyramid scheme. But I think if you look at the economics in a cold, hard sense, you really see it for what it is. It is a monetary network that is imposed on others. It does not allow any tolerance for free market competition, or any disruption of any kind, right? Any financial innovation that occurs outside of the space, it's not welcomed in the central banking model. And frankly, if you look at the back of the US dollar, there's a symbol there with a pyramid and the eye floating above it. And across the bottom is a banner written in Latin. It says Novus Ordo Seclorum. What this means is new order of the ages. So I actually think that, despite the difficulty in believing that the US dollar is a pyramid scheme, that there is something to that symbology in the US dollar. It's pretty interesting to think about. So again, the dollar that we think in today and value is only made possible because it was once redeemable for gold, right? So there's basically been this long con, or this long game legerdemain by governments, where they stepped in to resolve some of the shortcomings of money, of gold, right, by issuing a paper backed in gold, and then gradually pulled the rug out from under everyone. Said this thing is no longer redeemable for gold. This is much like the monopoly we saw with the Portuguese on panos, where they basically forcibly impose their monetary network on others. So in a very real and defined sense, this is a pyramid scheme. It's kind of a textbook pyramid scheme. And what's really bad about this is that those last recipients of the money, so those furthest away from the fiat currency spigot, those are the most economically vulnerable among us. Those are the people living on paycheck to paycheck. These are, fixed income, pensioners, retirees, the poor, anyone that's forced to hold most of their wealth in fiat currency, right? Living paycheck to paycheck. Those are the ones being most victimized by this scheme. So it's actually siphoning wealth from those that hold a larger proportion of their wealth, a larger percentage of their wealth in fiat currency, and reallocating that wealth to the richest, to those that own financial assets, to those that own real estate. So this is, like the inverse of what Robin Hood would have intended, where Robin Hood seeks to go out and steal from the rich and give to the poor. Central banking is the opposite of that. It's actually extracting wealth from the poor and reallocating it to the rich. So every time this pyramid scheme generates a new layer, right, it's, again, basically printing new money, which is in fact counterfeiting new currency, because it's not actual free market chosen money. It's not actually an extinguisher of debt. because there's always counterparty risk to holding a fiat currency. It's laying these layers from the top down, and it's externalizing these inflationary costs onto society. Again, most heavily onto those that receive the new money last, right? So as the money is printed, those with access to it first obtain it at maximum value. They're able to spend it in the marketplace to acquire goods and services while the money's still at maximum value before the broader circulating supply is increased and inflation has diluted the value of the currency, which is when later recipients actually start to feel the imposition of the tax in the form of price increases, right? That's what inflation is. And we're still it's not just a matter of the Fed printing dollars and putting new dollars into circulation. What they're actually doing is lending reserves to banks, right? That then lend against those reserves, use those reserves to create new loans to customers, which are often lower tier banks, that then in turn collateralize that debt to issue new loans to customers further down the pyramid, so on and so forth. So by the time each dollar of reserve that's created by the Fed actually enters broader circulation, it's levered up 50, 80, 100 times. So this actually has an exponential multiplicative effect on the broad money supply after it enters circulation. And the other disgusting thing about this is that the Fed itself, which is a privately owned organization, it has a set of undisclosed shareholders. I think they once numbered 12. I think they now have 10 shareholders. And I do have a list of who those shareholders are, but I can't vet its veracity. So, but rest assured, it's a lot of the richest and most powerful banking families in the world. And that the Fed itself has these private shareholders that own shares in its operations. Those shares pay a 6% annual dividend to those shareholders. So just for the right of being able to monopolize the United States money supply, which in turn, in its role as the international reserve currency, represents the monopolization of all the money in the world, basically serving as the central bank of the world. They siphon a rent at the rate of 6% per year. So it really is criminal, basically. It's just as coercive as the Portuguese monopolizing panels production, suppressing any competition violently, and then basically counterfeiting panels to acquire wealth from those around them. So it's very much the same dynamic. And, again, these dollars that are freshly printed, they're distributed in this trickle-down fashion from the central bank to higher tier banks and megacorps that can borrow cheaply, and on down to lower tier banks and smaller corporations. So what this does is it distorts the incentives to scale, so that there's actually a huge benefit to being, quote unquote, too big to fail, or as deemed so by the government, in that you have cheap access to cheap credit, and you basically have a safety net. Like, should you go belly up, you know that you're very likely to get a bailout from the government. So this distorts incentives such that companies seek to be a lot bigger, right? There's an advantage to size that there would not be in the free market. So we get this huge shredding of economic reality where basically the middle class and mid-sized businesses are decimated to favor a very, very large disparity in terms of being either too big to fail or being one of the many dispossessed by this model. So long as people in this fiat currency model remain sufficiently passive yet productive, right? So as long as they're working, so long as the dollar has somewhat relative stability, price stability over time, that people will continue to use it, unbeknownst to them that this increase in prices and inflation is not a natural phenomenon. So it's almost like it's an invisible form of tax that people have been conditioned to tolerate. And these schemes can be carried out for decades and even centuries, as we've seen with the U.S. dollar. But what inevitably happens is that because it's a leverage-based business, it constantly requires more production of more currency to satisfy prior existing debts. Because again, most of the money creation in a fiat-based economy is newly created debt, right? It's banks lending against reserves, and so on and so forth. So as these debts come due, there is a greater demand for more dollars to satisfy them. So that puts pressure on the central bank to produce even greater increases in the money supply with each round. And this is very clear from history. So it took the Fed 20 years to counterfeit the last $3 trillion of US M2 in the 20th century. So that was about from 1980 to the year 2000. The US M2 supply increased about $3 trillion. Prior to 2020, so from 2015 to 2020, the money supply also increased by $3 trillion. So USM2 increased $3 trillion from 2015 to 2020. So that went from 20 years to counterfeit it down to 5 by the early 21st century. And then this year in 2020, when COVID struck, the Fed counterfeited $3 trillion in 5 months. So we've now accelerated again, right? We've gone from a 4x increase in the rate of USM2 money production to a 12x increase just this year. So this debt-based system just requires exponentially more leverage to remain sustainable over time. And that's what causes it to self-annihilate. At some point, inflation sets in. And when inflation really takes hold, people can no longer trust the price stability of the money to conduct their economic affairs. So you end up with a situation like in Venezuela, where there's this cash in the streets. Literally, it's a dysfunctional currency. And at that point, people are flocking into gold, Bitcoin, or dollars, anything that can be that can reliably hold its value across time. That's what people are going to seek to hold. So again, these fiat currency pyramid schemes are only possible because they're able to insulate their inferior currencies from direct competitive pressure with gold, with gold historically. Because gold, again, as it remains relatively scarce to the increase in supply of dollars, in a free market, absent the monopolization and the coercion, it would naturally outcompete all these fiat currencies. People would opt for full reserve-backed currency, of course, because it would represent a token of liquid value that could not be compromised by theft, right? It would be an inviolable monetary technology, right? It's something that no one can dilute the supply of to benefit themselves at the detriment of you, right? So people in the free market would naturally select that, as they did with gold in the first place. But again, because of gold's issues, paper currencies were introduced to try and resolve some of its shortcomings, but that introduction of paper-backed gold introduced an attack vector that governments and central banks have exploited, essentially, to siphon wealth off of the money supply. And today, central banks hold about 20% of the total gold supply. So that all the gold in the world fits into 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. It's very scarce relative to most other things in the world. And so about 20% of that is held in central bank vaults. And they use this giant position in the market to basically, they've cornered the market. So they use it to manipulate the price of gold, often which is actively suppressing it, because you can't let gold appreciate too quickly. Otherwise, people, again, will flock out of fiat currencies into gold, right? So although gold is now marginally accessible, it's still a heavily manipulated market. Unless you're holding physical gold, if you're just holding shares in gold, you don't know how many times that's been rehypothecated. You don't know if the audit to the vault is trustworthy. You don't know if the gold itself has been manipulated. There's a story recently out of China that there was a gold broker who had put, I think, about 5 billion USD worth of gold with a liquidity provider to borrow against it. And in the March 2020 market meltdown, the liquidity provider went to liquidate the collateral because the price of gold collapsed in that liquidity crisis, and quickly discovered that it was gold. It was actually lead plated with fake gold, right? So someone had basically defiled the gold and used it as this false collateral to borrow against, and made off with a few billion US. So Bitcoin fixes that, right? Bitcoin has an immediately auditable money supply. When you're running a full node and you receive Bitcoin, you don't need to trust anyone. You just need to trust the software that the Bitcoin has been delivered to the wallet that you suggested. So in that sense, Bitcoin is a technology that is disruptive to gold, right? It's superior across all 5 monetary properties, as we've covered. It resists competitive suppression by central banks because central banks don't yet have a toehold in the total supply. Now, could they gain that toehold? Absolutely. But what that would entail is this game theoretic entry into the market, right? Where one central bank is competing to have a little bit, and then if another central bank sees them acquiring a position in the Bitcoin network, they then have to take a position themselves. And all other central banks are engaged in a similar prisoner's dilemma type affair, such that it creates demand for Bitcoin. And because Bitcoin, again, can't be financialized or easily faked, this actually drives demand for Bitcoin. So even if central banks try to get a giant toehold in the market, you're talking about multiple orders of magnitude increase in the total market cap of Bitcoin for that to happen. And then finally, as I've argued in some of my prior writing, Bitcoin is the discovery of absolute scarcity, right? So there was absolute scarcity. To actually have a guaranteed fixed supply of anything physical in the world was simply not possible before Bitcoin, because anything physical can be recreated, right? That's just a function of our time necessary to produce it. But for the first time in history, we have an asset with a perfectly predictable and fixed supply that no one can change. And it's hard to understate the ramifications of that. And I like to reference the old adage where people say there's 2 certainties in life. There's death, and there's taxes. I like to say that Bitcoin represents the third, which is 21 million. So it's a really big deal. So it's important to understand with Bitcoin that basically all monies exhibit this multi-level marketing valuation dynamic, or this redistributive effect, wherein the early adopters of a superior form of money, or really any form of money, always benefit disproportionately to later adopters, right? So in the world of fiat currency, as we've described, those with access to the printing press are perpetually the early adopters, right? They always get to adopt the new money earliest and spend it when it's at its maximal value. So that, with fiat currency, that's a positional asymmetry, which is like, it introduces politics into the game of money. So if I don't need to produce something valuable for society. I can just rub elbows with this bureaucrat who has access to cheap loans at a central bank level, and all of a sudden I can siphon wealth off of society by playing a political game versus producing something of value, right? Whereas in Bitcoin, since no one can manipulate the supply and anyone can freely enter or exit the mining market, right? It's a totally unhampered marketplace. There's no privileged access. There's no politics. It's just ruthlessly capitalistic. It's, do you have cheaper energy? If you can access cheaper energy, then you can produce digital gold yourself, right? That's it. That's the whole market for Bitcoin. So with Bitcoin, the early adopters tend to be those intelligent enough to understand that it is the most superior technology across all properties of money, and they are anticipating future adoption by others, right? People that want the most divisible, durable, recognizable, portable, and scarce money that's ever existed. People that want a money that cannot be easily confiscated from them. People that want a money that cannot be inflated whatsoever. And people that want a money that's perfectly predictable. Like if you own 1 million Bitcoin, you know with absolute certainty that you have one of 21 million that will ever exist. That cannot be said for any other asset in the world. So this Bitcoin system of money is much more symmetrical than the asymmetry introduced by fiat currency. And because it's perfectly predictable, Bitcoin also introduces something really interesting, in that it's perhaps our best implementation of the economic concept called perfect information. And perfect information is an economic ideal where basically all market participants have full knowledge of the game at all times. So we can think of the game of chess as a game of perfect information, where you can see all the squares on the board, you know all your opponent's players, all their possible moves, you know all your players and all your pieces and all their possible moves. But it's still, like, even with that perfect information, clearly there's still an infinitude of possibility within the game, right? So in economics, there tend to be, in the real world, a lot of information asymmetries. Like, people know kind of what's going on with their local domain, right? You know about your specific industry, your business, your employees, your customers at a relatively localized level. But in this theoretical state of perfect information, everyone would know everything there was to know, basically. And that, in theory, would lead to perfect competition in the marketplace, which would generate the maximum amount of wealth, because there would be all the asymmetries would be exploited, and everyone would be interoperating harmoniously in a sense that optimized for their skill set, right? Everyone's fulfilling the role that they're best at, and in doing so, generating the most aggregate wealth for society. So although that is like completely impossible, we're never going to get there, Bitcoin itself represents the greatest stepping stone towards that ideal state we'll ever have, because it is a money characterized by a perfectly predictable supply curve, right? Like we can trace it straight out to the year 2140 when the last Bitcoin will be mined, and we know with relatively high precision exactly how many Bitcoin will be in circulation at any given time. And again, that's what money is. Money is an insurance policy on the uncertainty of the future. So Bitcoin, as this embodiment of perfect information, sort of represents the ultimate insurance policy on the future. And, you know, in that sense, a great promise of Bitcoin is to pull global markets closer toward that ideal state of perfect competition, right? By basically circumventing a lot of the artificial regulation that is a drag on wealth creation, and by enabling people to hold value that can't be confiscated, right? It's impossible to develop trust in an economic network if I can't hold on to a property that can't be compromised, right? and this has its roots in natural law, where people have to have the right to life, liberty, and property if they are to pursue a proper moral life and to create value for others in the marketplace. That's just kind of the three tenets of capitalism as well. So if we go back to that image of the central bank pyramid scheme, and we have gold at the pinnacle, we have the dark central bank layer right below it, and then all the gray layers of newly created fiat currency below it, and it's constantly growing, right, as the money supply grows, diluting the value of the total supply. Whereas next to that, we can envision the basically perfectly fixed Bitcoin pyramid, because it has a money supply that doesn't change, right? So that the visual analogy here is, as this central bank pyramid grows taller and comparatively less trustworthy, because again, the money is more diluted, that they inevitably collapse over time into the full trustworthiness and perfect information of Bitcoin, right? People know that they can store their wealth here and it can't be compromised. So you exit a system where your wealth is constantly being stolen, and you migrate to a system where your wealth cannot be stolen, right? That is the driving impetus behind Bitcoin. And so you have this proverbial houses of cards, right? These central bank fiat currencies, that's what they are. They're houses of cards. They all end in hyperinflation or some other form of implicit default. So like, it's not even, this isn't a guesstimation of what's going to happen. This is historic observation. They all end by design in a self-annihilating flame of hyperinflation. And what all that means is that the political perpetrators that own the system were extracted maximum value. They parasited away maximum value before they killed the host, right? Bitcoin, first time in history, you have a place to park your liquid net worth that can't be stolen, can't be manipulated, can't be confiscated. Something like we've never had. And, again, whether it's understood by market participants or not, the natural conduct of business affairs over time pushes people away from the unknown supplies of fiat currencies. I cannot tell you how many dollars there are. I cannot tell you how many dollars there will ever be, nor can anyone, no matter what they may claim. I can tell you with absolute certainty how many Bitcoin are in circulation, and I can tell you with absolute certainty how many will ever be in circulation, right? No more than. So that is the driving force. People moving away from uncertainty towards certainty. That's it. That's what drives Bitcoin adoption. So when we look at money that way, we have a lot to be hopeful for in the world. So we have this perfectly known money supply, which is a corruption-proof alternative to the totally elastic supply of fiat currency that can just totally be expanded at will. So in that sense, Bitcoin is honest money saving the world from the falsehood of fiat currency. And it's hard to overstate how big of a deal that is. We've never had a money supply that no one could manipulate to benefit themselves at the expense of others, such that much of the world history, as we've talked about, has been that dynamic. People trying to get hold of the money and manipulate its supply to extract wealth from others. And this goes into kind of a transcendental territory where Bitcoin may actually be what the ancient alchemists spent centuries pursuing, which was the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone. And in archaic texts, the philosopher's stone was said to be the ultimate discovery that would serve as an antidote to state tyranny. It was an incorruptible substance to save the world from corruption, basically. And 21 million Bitcoin, again, is the third certainty we've ever had. It's the only incorruptible number in the world. Anything, the supply of anything else can be changed. So it's really interesting. And a lot of us may think that alchemy was some hocus pocus stuff in the past, but Carl Jung described alchemy as the dream from which science emerged. So there was a belief at one point in history by the church that Christ's sacrifice represented the final redemption. That all there was to be done was to follow his teachings, and nothing else needed to be done in the world. But there was a group of people that forked off of the church called the alchemists, and they believed that they could find redemptive knowledge by experimenting in nature. Right? They actually thought that they could discover this philosopher's stone, which would embody the properties of Christ in a material substance. And alchemy was practiced for thousands of years all over the world, and the alchemical methodologies became the precursors to the scientific method. So this actually grew into science. And this has really deep roots. Isaac Newton himself was an alchemist. And a lot of my knowledge on alchemy I actually learned from Jordan Peterson in his book Maps of Meaning, which he got from Carl Jung as well. So I'd like to read you a passage from there. It says, quote, "The sequence of the alchemical transformation paralleled Christ's passion, paralleled the myth of the hero and his redemption. The essential message of alchemy is that the individual rejection of tyranny, voluntary pursuit of the unknown and terrifying, predicated upon faith in the ideal, may engender an individual transformation so overwhelming that its equivalent can only be found in the most profound of religious myths. The lapis philosophorum is, quote, agent of transformation, equivalent to the mythological redemptive hero, able to turn base metals into gold. It is, as such, something more valuable than gold, just as the hero is more valuable than any of his concrete productions," unquote. So, who knows, right? The texts on alchemy are deep and complicated and wild, but I find it very interesting that this dream from which science was born was guided by this North Star of ultimately discovering an incorruptible substance that would free the world from state tyranny. And the other belief was that to attain that, the Philosopher's Stone, that they actually had to elevate the morality in themselves, right? People had to elevate their own moral character development in order to achieve this goal. And I find it interesting that, Western civilization today predicated, as we talked about earlier, on the sovereignty of the individual, right? Like innocent until proven guilty and habeas corpus. So we have from this system that's best reflected the principles of the free market that's ever existed, and has supported the development of science to its highest achievements, as we're seeing in digital technology today. And at the pinnacle of the confluence of those forces, we have Bitcoin, right? This free market money emerging that's consuming anachronistic institutions like central banking and governments. I think Bitcoin and its incorruptible value of 21 million may actually be the Philosopher's Stone. So call me crazy, but we'll see what happens. And another thing that's interesting about that is, again, as the alchemists were trying to elevate their character to get closer to redemptive knowledge, the discovery of redemptive knowledge in nature, it was actually thought that the Philosopher's Stone would engender radical transformations in those that interact with it. And if you go and ask a lot of Bitcoiners today how, like people that are really deep into Bitcoin, how it's affected their life, you'll find a lot of different answers, but they're all sort of on the common thread of, lower time preference stuff, right? So thinking more long-term, eating healthier, being more family-oriented, being more philanthropic, more community conscious, all these things. So that's another interesting alchemical aspect of Bitcoin, is it's actually engendering these personal transformations in people, which I think is fascinating. And what if it is? If it is this incorruptible substance that's the antidote to state tyranny, um, and the other thing is, like, again, markets generate truth, right? So Bitcoin is something that emerged on the free market as this meta property right, right, which is one of the core pillars of capitalism, is that you have the exclusive rights to your own labor. Could it be that Bitcoin is one of the ultimate forms of truth, right? Just like we said, a price is a form of truth, a tool is a form of truth, and individual virtue is a form of truth. It seems like Bitcoin might be a fusion of these three things, right? It has its price is a truthful barometer on the failure of success of central banking, right? It's how much people trust software over old institutions. As a tool, it's the best form of money we've ever had, right? It's perfectly divisible, durable, recognizable, portable, scarce. And then this virtue side of things, it's like almost when people, through interacting with Bitcoin, it actually incentivizes and encourages them to become more virtuous. So it's very, very interesting. And so if Bitcoin is one of these highest forms of truth, one of Jordan Peterson's definitions of God is the truthful speech that rectifies pathological hierarchies. And I don't think you can find any more pathological hierarchy in the world than central banking, right? It's an institution shrouded in falsehood, built on theft. They pander these highbrow lies to people. That's this Keynesian Kool-Aid brainwashing to try and protect their monopoly and justify theft via inflation. So it's so interesting to me that Bitcoin might actually be this beacon of truth, just incinerating the institutional falsity of central banking. And I love this quote. Benjamin Franklin once said that, quote, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God," unquote. So if Bitcoin is these things, if it's even a glimmer of these things, then I really believe it is God's money, even in a secular sense, right? Even if you just consider God to be the truth rectifying pathology in our social constructions, then Bitcoin really is the most godly money we've ever had. So to talk about God, like freedom, love, truth, God, or the idea of God, is timeless, right? And I'm not talking about a guy in the sky here. So the ancient idea in Genesis, which is derived from ancient texts that have been written for as long as there's been writing, that have been told for tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years before that, is that God is the force that freely confronts the chaos of the world with truthful speech and courage to convert it into good and habitable order, right? So again, and we are made in the image of God, right? We have the Logos, which is the divine power to go out into the world, face chaos, learn, construct order from it that helps us deal with the chaos of nature in an even better and more useful way over time. So there's something there, like, again, our ability to generate these abstractions and orient ourselves against them and then accumulate our learnings over time, right? The Logos itself, that is what makes us the dominant species in the world in kind of the Yuval Harari, author of Sapiens, sense. And this Logos it's a self-generating power that lets us freely confront the world and reconfigure it to suit our needs, right? So it's very, very interesting. And in that sense, we dream our future, right? Because the dream starts as a visualization of possibilities, and it comes before articulated thought and understanding. Similar to how science itself was born from this global dream of alchemy, right? So in that way, like our futures are seated in our imagination, and we call forth this world through free speech, free action, free thought. And you're never going to properly capture the idea of God with words. Just like I would say with love and truth and freedom, these things are beyond words, right? They're ineffable. But realizing that words always miss the mark in this domain of the divine, we can venture to say something about God in a secular sense. And we'd say that God is the anti-entropic principle that propagates eternally through all life. And as G.K. Chesterton put this, he said, a dead thing can flow downstream. Only a living thing can swim against it, right? So everything in the universe accords to this second law of thermodynamics, which is increasing entropy, increasing chaos. Every system tends to become more disorderly over time. The only countervailing force to that universal tendency is life. We are anti-entropy, right? We convert chaos into order. That is our divine purpose. And that is what God is whatever that principle propagating through all of us, not just humans, but all life is. That's what God is in a secular scientific sense. And so again, if we build social structures that honor the logos within us and honor the logos in others and maximize its free expression and minimize coercion and violence and the suppression of the logos, that's how we create the best outcomes for the most people across time. And that's what Bitcoin's about. So it's in vogue today, and it's very popular for people to blame capitalism for all the myriad problems in the world. It's become a scapegoat for a lot of issues, and I think it's very unfortunate that people don't actually understand the words that they're using. And again, the words, right, the logos, when they're not used with precision or they're manipulated, our action follows closely behind it. Things just go awry really quickly. So at the heart of every modern economy in the world today is an institution of socialism, the central bank. So to define capitalism and socialism, I go back to the very primitive sense. So I say the first man that ever dug a hole into the earth to protect himself from the elements was the first capitalist. He was doing work on something that he was going to use to value himself, right? Creating fruits of his own labor that he's going to harvest in the future. And that the other man who violently encroached on his tiny territory for his own selfish purposes was the first socialist. He was the man that thought other people's work he has a right to. He has a right to better distribute the fruits of those labor than the creator of the fruits of those labor. So that's the fundamental difference between capitalism and socialism. Capitalism means you have the exclusive rights to your own time to spend it how you want, studying, creating, doing, and anything of value that you create in that process. You have the exclusive rights to the fruits of those labor, and that you may trade those fruits with other self-owned people, self-owned capitalists doing the same thing. And that's how we exploit the comparative advantage between us, right? You're better at one thing, I'm better at another, third person's better at something else. That's how we mutually collaborate economically to generate more wealth than we could on our own. That's what capitalism is all about. Whereas socialism, to a greater or lesser extent, means that other people, often called the state or the government, have rights to the fruits of your labor, right? So if you spend an hour of your day digging this hole that's going to protect yourself, all of a sudden 20% of that hole belongs to other people or the state for their own purposes. So that's the polarity between capitalism and socialism. And socialism today, if you think, again, the central bank has this currency that we're all forced to use. So it's an enforced social network, but only a select few, the administrators of that system, are able to benefit from it. They siphon wealth off of everyone else in that system. So it's anti-capitalist, right? Capitalist system would be money is just another tool. Entrepreneurs are free to experiment and compete with one another in the marketplace to see what works best over time. We'd have a free banking system. People could use gold, silver, whatever they wanted. Although, as we've explored, free market forces push towards one money. We would not have this enforced fiat monetary system that we all suffer under today. So to compare this modern fiat currency system to some of the ancient slavery systems we explored earlier, we'll take a real close look at the Fed. So what I did in the piece, we said earlier that a Great Pyramid took 10 billion human hours to construct. We said earlier that the transatlantic slave trade stole 6.8 billion hours per year for 365 years for a total of 2.5 trillion hours stolen. Looking at just the Fed, so just the central bank of the United States and the indirect central bank of the world, since the year 1980, here's what I did. I took the average annual increase in US M2 money supply and divided that by the average hourly wage rate in the US to develop a proxy for the total hours printed or stolen by the Federal Reserve each year since 1980 to present, and arrived at some relatively startling conclusions. So since 1981, my analysis went back to 1981, bureaucrats at the Fed have stolen approximately 7.6% working hours off of productive people every year for 40 years straight, right? Assuming that each person works 2,000 hours per year, which is about right, 50 weeks plus 2 weeks vacation at 40 hours a week, that would be equivalent to enslaving a workforce of 11.7 million people for 40 years straight. So the Federal Reserve is actually stealing enough hours from working people that it is equivalent to having a slave labor force of 11.7 million people for 40 years straight. And comes to a total of almost 1 trillion hours stolen. And the numbers, they're just staggering. So since 1981, the Fed has been stealing approximately 23.5 billion hours per year. That is almost 4 times as much per year as the transatlantic slave trade. And that's enough hours each year to build 2 1/3 Great Pyramids. So in terms of absolute time stolen per year, the Fed alone, this is not looking at other central banks, is the greatest institution of time theft and slavery that has ever existed. It's just less visible, it's less visceral, because we don't actively see them putting guns in people's faces or people in chains and whipping them, right? They're just taking a little bit of time from a much larger pool of people. But the theft behind it, the principle and dynamics behind it are equally as insidious, right? And arguably worse because it's much larger, right? It's a giant institution of invisible slavery. And it shreds the social moral fabric of humanity, right? People, it's hard to cultivate trust and maintain community and develop virtue as an entrepreneur in the free market when you're constantly being robbed, right, by these non-value adding bureaucrats. So this is the cancer on the soul of humanity, in my humble opinion. This constant theft implemented directly into our system of trust, which is money, is just demoralizing to us across the board. And it drives wealth disparity It drives this fiat slave mentality. It's dilutive to our moral characters and our being and the nuclear family. All these things we're seeing, which here I would point people to the website what the fuck happened at 1971.com. So WTF happened 1971.com. It just shows a wide range of data visualizations that show the collapse in various aspects of life since 1971. Really, really eye-opening. And so when we stop conceiving of central banking as an economic story and start to see it as a crime story, we're starting to get the true picture. Capitalism itself is rooted in truth, right? It's hard work, delayed gratification, honest trade. Socialism, on the other hand, is rooted in falsehood. It's propagandizing, bureaucratizing, and theft, right? That's how the state enriches itself. It's through theft, through deception, through violence, pure and simple. And like the counterfeit operations we saw with agri-beads and Panos, these operations also fund violence, right, at a very large scale. And in the 20th century, we actually saw the per capita death in warfare increase 4 times its usual amount. And as Ron Paul said, that it's no coincidence that the century of central banking and the century of total war were the same century, right? It's because a state can just print money to finance its military efforts without any need to directly borrow or tax a citizen, right? That they can fund these perpetual warfare and imperial campaigns all over the world. If instead a government, specifically say the US government, was forced to send its taxpayers a bill each year for its military efforts, people would revolt against it, right? No one's going to pay $10,000, $20,000 a year per family to support the war effort. So in looking at it through that lens, we see that socialistic fiat currency has been this weapon of tyranny, not only in an economic sense, but also in a kinetic sense across the 20th century. Over 169 million people were murdered by governments in the 20th century alone, right? This includes genocide, warfare, and all these other militarized state activities. That is over half the population in the United States. And it's got a name. It's a modern day mega atrocity called democide. So you can look up the stats on it. But all of this senseless murder at scale is funded and rooted in the central bank monopoly on money. They are only able to perpetrate this falsehood and crime against humanity because they're able to steal from everyone in the shadows. So again, this is what Bitcoin's all about, is that it breaks this cycle of central banking criminality and disrupts the financing mechanism and the incentives to act violently. So in that sense, I've called it a weapon of peace. And I think it's an apt moniker. So to boil it down real simply, socialism is fraud, right? It basically is the belief that I have rights to labor that you've created, right? It's just not fair. It doesn't make any sense. It's inconsistent with natural law. And as Nassim Taleb says very succinctly, quote, "If you see a fraud and you do not say fraud, you are a fraud," unquote. So those that see and understand the criminal elements of central banking and remain silent as to its criminality are complicit in the fraud that is central banking. And you are perpetrating an evil scheme on your fellow brothers and sisters and family and humanity and all the generations to come. So you have to really think closely about the nature of the money that you're using, who is profiting from it, and how are they spending those profits? To what ends are those profits being used? I promise you, if you keep asking this question, this what is money question, you'll go further and further down this rabbit hole, and you'll come to see that Bitcoin is the most honest money that's ever existed. Disruptive to gold, disruptive to government, and disruptive to global warfare. And the central planning in the market for money, it's not a new idea. In Marx's 1848 Manifesto of the Communist Party, the fifth measure reads, quote, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly, unquote. So straight out of Marx's playbook is central banking, right? Central banking is a Marxist institution. So it blows my mind that anyone can, with a straight face, call America a free market capitalist society when we have a giant institution of socialism at our heart. Money's one half of every transaction, so we are at least one half socialist. But as we've explored, these socialistic impulses become infectious into the broader economy. So anything closer to that fiat currency spigot actually moves away from being capitalist and competitive to be something more socialistic, as we see in healthcare, we see in education. Anything that's close to the state just rots from the inside. And we have to speak of central banking truthfully. It is an anti-capitalist institution. I like to call it monetary socialism, right? It's a group of people, of administrators, of bureaucrats that are operating under the presupposition that they have rights to the fruits of our labor, right? They're a non-value adding parasite to the productive economy of society. We really need to take that to heart and accept what institutions are governing our behavior in the modern world. And it's Karl Marx, just to dig into his character, but first of all, he was a known racist. There's a lot of writing about his blatant racial slurs he used to make. I had a friend yesterday, Jimmy Song, tell me he's reading a book on Marx, and that Marx was known to have memorized long passages in Paradise Lost, I think, with Mephistopheles, which is basically the devil. He would memorize long passages from this character, the devil character, and recite them often. So he clearly had a satanic bent to him. And it's no surprise that, even on our bills today, we have, well, let me back up. It's no surprise that central banking is a system that has, it drives these wealth disparities, that is predatory on the poor, right? Many of who are racial or ethnic minorities. So we can very literally say that central banking is a racist institution. It is adding value to those who have capital and extracting value away from those who do not. Now, I'm not advocating for equality of outcome or any of that socialist bullshit. That's a total utopian fantasy. It's impossible to have equality of outcome. Again, we benefit because we're all different and we can trade, right? That naturally creates an inequality of distribution across all spectrums. Wealth, looks, lifespan, everything's different for everyone, right? You can't change that. That's fundamental to nature. But what you can do is create an equality of opportunity. And that's what a free market is, right? It's just like, here are the rules, everyone can play by them, go. Central banking, though, is a twisting of the rules. It's a back door, if you will, on the game, right? Where someone, if you're playing Monopoly and someone can just keep pulling money out of their pocket, right? That's who you're playing against when you're playing against a central bank or playing in a central banked economy. So slave masters in general, including central banks, they seek to steal the benefits of work that others have created without making any requisite sacrifices themselves. So again, across trading societies historically, gold was favored as money because it required a proof of work to obtain, right? You couldn't print gold. It was the least reproducible asset, monetary asset in the world, and that's why it was selected. Because people always want to hold something that's hard to produce, right? That protects it from inflation. That protects it from confiscation, the value from confiscation. So this is something Szabo calls an unforgeable costliness, right? There's an unforgeable costliness to gold that enables it to self-represent the sacrifices necessary to procure it. And in that type of economy, work, again, is something that carries us forward, carries civilization forward, in that we're creating value from others and we're gleaning innovations that benefit the whole of society forever, right? Every time we make a new discovery or a new technological breakthrough, it sticks with us and it continues to benefit people forever. And if we look at that in a very interesting way, that innovation itself is just any tool that allows us to accomplish greater results in less time, right? So it actually lifts us further and further out of the ravages of time, right? We're able to create more and do more in less time as we become more technologically sophisticated. So in that sense, work itself, it's like a noble pursuit that carries us closer to the timelessness of God, right? Again, just in a secular sense, like freedom, love, truth, these timeless concepts. Work actually brings us closer to that spiritual, metaphysical domain, whatever you want to call it. And the opposite of that, right? The opposite of work would be theft, right? Theft is the confiscation of other people's work and a twisting of the moral fabric that inevitably snaps back in your face, right? As Jordan Peterson says, his 20 years as a clinical psychologist, he's never seen anyone get away with anything ever, right? Like, even if you think you can get away with something in the short term, it's going to come back and manifest itself in your life. So and this is what, religion's all about. It's all about proper moral action. And I think it's actually pointing to something very real, something we haven't perhaps articulated scientifically yet, but I think the moral dimension is as real as the spatiotemporal dimension.